This presentation will show the work of and will summarize the work of all the partners. So thanks to all for contributing to this first draft of guidelines. And also I will present with Peter Viare from Vito that helped us in drafting this guidance. So our presentation will talk about the guidance document and main contents. Then Peter will talk about the state of the art of the uncertainty in the emissions. And then I'll show some first preliminary results found about uncertainty found in REMY, and then we will drive first recommendations. So, which is the aim of this guidance? The aim is to provide suggestion, harmonized recommendation on how to reduce emission uncertainty to improve air quality modeling and better drive air quality plans in the framework of the Air Quality Directive. So the idea is that these recommendations are derived by REMY's results both on emissions estimation and on the air quality modeling. So timelines, the idea is to share with all of you, with all experts in the emission inventories next month, in the middle of July, and a first draft, and then provide the final version of the recommendations in April 2024 at the end of the project. So this is the index of these documents that we are writing. We will talk today of the state of the art with Peter and of the first uncertainty investigation found in REMY. So please, Peter, I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, Giuseppe. So, as Giuseppe said, okay, we were asked in the first place to establish a kind of state of the art of what are current requirements from emission inventories and what is the current status on the emission inventories, with a focus in this case on the local or the more urban scale emission inventories. So I'll start with a constatation that, okay, the CSIC obliges EU members to make these emission inventories, so they have to provide the emission inventories every year. But okay, it's an obligation at the national level, so people have to provide. Initially, it was only one number for the whole country, but afterwards, like now, they're providing gridded emissions, but this is at a resolution of 0.1 degree. So it's a low resolution or too low resolution for local scale modeling. There's also a guidebook that tells the member states how they have to make these emissions. So this EMAP-EEA guidebook, which provides guidelines on how the member states have to produce the emission inventories. I also put there two examples of emission inventories. So the official one, the EMAP inventory, and of course there's a number of European or even global emission inventories, like the MAC inventory or the Council inventory, that exist for Europe. So for this local scale, there's not such a same guidance document, so there's no guidance on how you have to produce urban or local scale inventories. And what I would also like to mention is that with the revision of the Air Quality Directive, there's more and more need for air quality modeling, so the importance of producing emission inventories will become more and more important in the future. The EMAP guidebook on uncertainties, okay, so the member states are obliged to produce, together with the inventories, something on the uncertainty in these inventories. So they do not have to, in the guidebook there's no mention of how you have to improve the uncertainty, but there is some guidelines on how you can quantify the uncertainty. So for the actual improving your inventory in terms of how to make it less uncertain, the inventory delegates this to the IPCC report. So now I have a few slides on which are the main contributions to the uncertainty. So this is also coming from the EEA guidebook. And so what I would like to mention here especially is that for the activity data, that the uncertainty is actually lower for the activity data than for the emission factors. And that's okay. When you look at the activity data, the uncertainty will be, of course, lower when you go to national or official statistics than when you go to default values. Then, of course, if you talk about local scale emission inventories, then okay, we of course, will have to either extrapolate these national statistics, or we'll have to rely on other sources. So, in general, you can say that the uncertainty will probably be higher on the local databases. So like I said, the emission factors, they're more uncertain. So if you remember the previous slide, we were talking about a few percent, ranging up to maybe 50 to 100%. Well, in this case, we start at 10 to 30%, and it goes up to an order of magnitude. So the guidance book also says, okay, in many cases, its uncertainty ranges for emission factors are rather difficult to obtain. So and the uncertainty is related to how many measurements you have for determining these emission factors. So because in some cases, like if you look at this one, you have no more measurements, but this is just derived from assumptions or from calculations that you do. So of course that will be more uncertain. And like I said, the uncertainty of activity data is much smaller than the uncertainty of the emission factors. This is a table also again from the guidebook, and what I think is interesting here, but you can also, I guess, more or less know maybe, is that the uncertainty will depend on the type of pollutant. So you can see the sulfur dioxide, the uncertainty is much smaller than for nitrogen oxide. That the highest uncertainty is probably related to the ammoniac. And then it also depends on the sector. So for some sectors like the industry, the uncertainty will be lower than other sectors like the agriculture, where the uncertainty is a lot higher. So it depends on the sectors. What I should also say here is probably that, okay, these are tables that were produced for the national inventories. So it also depends, of course, where you are, where your local inventory is being derived for. Because for a local inventory, you could probably imagine that the uncertainty will depend on what is happening in that particular area. And then some other contributions to the uncertainty, so the temporal scale. So the official inventories, they are produced only for yearly values. Maybe sometimes you can see monthly values, but they're not producing hourly values. Well, the models, they need hourly values, so we're doing calculations on an hourly time step. So in some way, we'll have to, from these yearly values, we have to derive hourly values. The way this is normally done is that they have time factors for time of the hour, the day of the week, and the month. So what Fabricio was also showing, where you kind of multiply your yearly value by a factor for which hour of the day are we, which day of the week are we, and which month of the year are we. What you can then say is that these factors, okay, the way it's used today, in most cases, these factors are not different for any of the countries, so they use the same factors for all countries. While studies have shown if you take into account where you are in the country, there could be a different pattern of living or something that can cause that you have a different factor. And there's, of course, also differences between the years. I think a typical one is for the heating. So you're not heating every year in the same way. The heating will depend on how cold it is outside. For the spatial resolution, the standard ones, like I said, are mostly in the range of 0.05, 0.1 degrees, which is quite low for doing local scale modeling. So what then people often do is what Baker showed, that to downscale the emissions to a higher resolution. So there's really a need for a higher resolution to correctly present your concentrations radius near sources in a local urban scale model. And then the speciation, one of the last ones, and this is, I think, something that relates to what Johanna said. In the model, you have a certain number of species, while the emissions are reported typically for another kind of species. You have to kind of map your species that are reported in the emission inventory to the species used in the model. The typical examples are the NOx, NMVOC, and the PM10. So people use some kind of profile or splits to translate these to model species. So the mapping will depend on your air quality model. And then, okay, I think a good observation there that Johanna made is what we often see is people are producing the emission inventories, and then when they do this modeling for the emission inventory production, they already have this different species, but then they just aggregate them to the model, the species they have to report. Then afterwards, the modelers have to kind of disaggregate them again. So it would be better if, as a modeler, we would have access to the results of these emission models directly, so they're not aggregated for reported species. And then not to validate, but to kind of check the quality of your model. Well, the problem is that we don't really know the real emissions, so you have to kind of estimate the accuracy, and that's, yeah, it's impossible because you don't know the real values. So they alternatively proposed is to compare emission inventories. This, of course, does not prove that one emission inventory is better than the other, but because you can, by doing this benchmarking, you can see consistencies in your inventories, and this way you can maybe go and look, okay, why is this emission inventory different from the other one? And a method has been proposed by Philip Tunis and other people. This bottom part is something I took from a slide that was presented at the FAIRMO meeting. So this, in this case, you see there's a big difference between the blue and the red one. So this actually can be then an indication that maybe something is wrong in one of the two inventories. So this method of benchmarking is not an absolute way of proving that emission inventories are correct, because they could all be wrong even if they're different, but it could be maybe a way of detecting inconsistencies.
So thank you, Peter, for this very interesting overview on the state of the art. So quickly to go to the end of the presentation, I'll show some example of the uncertainty found in REMY's project. So we have seen this morning, we have already seen this morning about the emission factors uncertainty. Marco has discussed about domestic heating of wood oven pizzerias, also of road duster and suspension. So what could be the lesson learned? The lesson learned is that probably some specific sources important at local scale, for instance pizzerias in Milan or waste combustion in some areas in Poland, should be focused in local emission inventory. Local emission factors should be tested and could improve the knowledge on emission processes. So yeah, I think that's the first lesson learned. Second, we have seen presented by Gregor the nice tool to relocate at high resolution European or national emission inventory. What this tool could be helpful, first of course, for countries, regions where you don't have local emission inventory, but second, as Peter just mentioned, it could be a useful tool for this benchmarking of local bottom-up emission inventory, not again to say which one is the right one, but to check for eventual inconsistencies, looking at the differences of the two emission inventories. The advantage of this tool that the two emission inventories are at the same or similar resolution. Finally, Elena has shown the comparison between the PMF and CAN's approach for source apportionment, and which could be the main causes of uncertainty related of emission. For sure, the spatial resolution of the emission, the temporal modulation, we have discussed a lot this morning, for instance, in the case of biomass or ammonia emission, and then the underestimation of lack of emission coming from exhaust or non-exhaust emission from traffic and other activities. So finally, to conclude, which could be the first recommendation, for sure, we need a guidance for local emission inventories, because we have the national one, but probably it is not enough for local emission inventories. So use benchmarking and quality assurance of bottom-up emission inventory, local emission inventory. And then from REMYs, so these first are coming from TerrAria, the last one are coming from REMYs. So spatial and temporal higher resolution are important and should be focused on local emission inventory. And improving the emission factor for specific local sources could be another contribution at the local level. So thank you for the attention.